Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 215, April 21st to April 27th, 1865. Last week, we covered the assassination of Abraham Lincoln and subsequent manhunt for his killer, John Wilkes Booth. Abraham Lincoln would at least see the surrender of Lee and almost the conclusion of the war. It is an interesting question of just how things have progressed. If he had not been killed, how different perhaps Reconstruction would have gone. This week, we will see the conclusion of the subtheater of the war, Johnston and his ragtag army still being at large. But Sherman is about to close the door. Before we get into that, though, we do need to talk about some Patreon content. And of course, we do have some here. We had a picture slideshow posted most recently that shows several of the locations that we have talked about here leading up to Lee's surrender. Those being Fort Stedman, Five Forks, and Sailor's Creek. I think probably the latter of the two being off the beaten path, if you will. If you're frequenting any kind of Civil War sites, they're kind of out there in the pretty remote, and you really have to make a journey to them to see them. So hopefully that was interesting to see the sites themselves and hear a little bit about those locations. So we have picture slideshows, we have movie reviews, memoir reviews. We're going to continue with more moving forward here as well. So stay tuned for what we have coming down the pike. And of course, those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show, and they are greatly appreciated. So when we last left off in the Carolinas, the last-ditch effort by the Confederates had failed with the action at Bentonville. Johnston had a small opportunity and then almost saw his army be completely cut off and probably forced to capitulate right then and there. Raleigh was next in the sights for the Union forces, Sherman accepting the surrender of the city. It would be here that the army would learn of Lincoln's assassination. Until that point, the march in North Carolina had been more lenient than that of Georgia and South Carolina. There had been more control and discipline over the troops. Nothing like what had happened at Columbia had yet occurred, but with the news of the president's untimely death, this would lead to some men thinking they needed to take action into their own hands. The only thing that would stop him would be Black Jack Logan seeking to keep order with artillery that was loaded with canister. This stiff resistance would keep order and thus save Raleigh from the fate that might have been worse than Columbia. Black Jack Logan, who had been a Democrat before the war, would not get any friends by this action, much as Sherman was about to not get any friends either. But these had been those who had seen the destruction and wanted to avoid that if possible. That does kind of go to show how there are a lot of individuals in the army that did not particularly agree with what happened in Columbia. They thought that was a little bit of a step too far. And obviously there are those who are more interested in looting for whatever reason, right? It could be just for your own gains, your own purposes. Could be for, the moral aspect of things. But obviously there were those who definitely did not want to see that happen to Raleigh. Raleigh was the last capital to have to fall into the Union hands during the war, right? We talked about how if Florida is really the only state that the capital doesn't fall into Union hands, we had that final Confederate victory there to hopefully stem the tide of Union forces, even though capture of that city wasn't really primarily the goal. And that kind of shows you just how Florida was not really considered to be too strategically important toward the outcome of the war. Again, there's not really a whole lot of people down there anyway, so you have that. But Raleigh is the last probably major capital to fall into the Union hands, or kind of like check that box, right? We had talked a little bit about Wilson's raid that gets into Alabama. There we go. Obviously, Alabama, Montgomery is going to fall into Union hands as well. So Raleigh here is obviously North Carolina, a state where there are a lot of pro-Union sentiments, right? Carolina was on the kind of the border between, there were a lot of people that did not want to succeed, right? You have this with these other states that are closer to the border, closer to the Mason-Dixon line, right? Border states, if you will. So obviously there's going to be more of a lenient attitude toward them. We talked about that before, and this might have changed things. This might have been completely unnecessary, really, because at this point the war, again, is essentially over. In the meantime, Johnston would be informed that Lee had surrendered at Appomattox. His army would be in a pretty sorry state. Jefferson Davis, who had escaped Richmond, would urge him to continue. Unlike Lee, Johnston's army was not trapped. It could potentially escape if the Confederates so wished. They might have been able to continue, but desertions were rampant. On paper, Johnston had many more men than he probably had in the ranks. As a result, he would reach out to Sherman to meet on April 17th. Sherman would select a quieter place near Greensboro where Johnston's army sat to meet with the Confederate general. As a result, Bennett's farm, or Bennett's place, was selected, and in a small cabin, Johnston and Sherman would meet. Johnston had been really the last general to defeat Sherman, handing him a blemish to his Atlanta campaign at Kennesaw Mountain. In the coming negotiations, Wade Hampton and John Breckinridge representing the Confederate government at this point, would be involved. There would be some testy moments, Hampton in particular lauding over his near capture of Kilpatrick at Monroe's Crossroads. Schofield actually drawing ire as well in the process. The meeting would result in the following terms. And this is laid out on April 18th, 1865. Memorandum or basis of agreement made this 18th day of April, 1865, near Durham Station in the state of North Carolina, by and between General Joseph E. Johnston, commanding the Confederate Army, and Major General William T. Sherman, commanding the Army of the United States in North Carolina, both present. First, the contending armies now in the field to maintain the status quo until notice is given by the commanding general of any one to its opponent, and reasonable time, say 48 hours allowed. Second, the Confederate armies now in existence be disbanded and conducted to their several state capitals, there to deposit their arms and public property in the state arsenal, and each officer and man to execute and file an agreement to cease from acts of war and to abide by the action of both state and federal authority. The number of arms and munitions of war to be reported to the Chief Ordnance at Washington, D.C., subject to the future action of the Congress of the United States, and in the meantime to be used solely to maintain peace and order within the borders of the states respectively. Third, the recognition by the Executive of the United States of the several state governments, of their officers and the legislatures taking the oaths prescribed by the Constitution of the United States, and where conflicting state governments have resulted from the war, the legitimacy of all shall be submitted to the Supreme Court of the United States. Fourth, the reestablishment of all federal courts in several states with powers as defined by the Constitution and laws of Congress. Fifth, the people and inhabitants of all the states to be guaranteed, so far as the executive can, their political rights and franchises, as well as their rights of person and property as defined by the Constitution of the United States, respectively. Sixth, the executive authority of the government of the United States not to disturb any of the people by reason of the late war, so long as they live in peace and quiet, abstain from acts of armed hostility, and obey the laws in existence at the places of their residence. Seventh, in general terms, the war to cease, a general amnesty so far as the executive of the United States can command, on condition of the disbandment of the Confederate armies, the distribution of arms, and the resumption of peaceful pursuits by the officers and men hitherto composing said armies. Not being fully empowered by our respective principle to fulfill these terms, we individually and officially pledge ourselves to promptly obtain the necessary authority and to carry out the above program. William T. Sherman and J.E. Johnston. So, you might be sitting here and saying, wow, that seems a little bit different than what had happened at Appomattox, and you would be absolutely correct. In agreeing to these terms, Sherman had erred greatly into the political realm. He essentially gave amnesty to the Confederate government officials, including Jefferson Davis. Edwin Stanton would decry the terms that Sherman was giving. Already there had been rumbling against Sherman, especially after the investigation into his ways, which formerly enslaved individuals were treated during his march to Georgia. He had done little to dissuade the negative opinion for himself. But Sherman was eager for a conclusion of the war. He at least would write after the war how essentially this hard war had been brought on their insistence to continue fighting in the South. This had prompted these extremely lenient terms during the first round at Bennett's Place. Now, some of the other things that we need to consider here, Johnston did give Sherman his last L, right? His last defeat. That's something that we need to consider. Joseph Johnston, right or wrong, and obviously I think if you've been listening to this long enough, you probably know my opinion on the matter, but for right or wrong, he's considered still to be probably one of the premier generals besides Robert E. Lee. Now, why you actually get to that conclusion, it's hard to tell. A lot of these guys are going off of their pre-war records, their pre-war reputation, and certainly I think Johnston kind of rides that out a little bit. Not a terrible general officer, but also not really the best, and certainly when you're Ulysses S. Grant after the war writing about how you were only really afraid of Johnston, it's kind of ridiculous in my opinion. However, obviously I wasn't there, and it's kind of a little bit of hindsight, right? But regardless of that, you do have that on the back of Sherman's mind. Sherman has not been interested in thoroughly defeating this army. He would have done so, probably, if he had actually put his mind to it. Now, that probably would have added to his casualty lists. It probably would have, again, continued to turn the populace against him. So there is a little bit of that, right? He doesn't want to completely destroy these armies. He doesn't want to kill everybody, right? So he's been kind of taking the foot off the gas in certain situations and allowing the Confederate army to still be around. But then you still have Johnston, and he actually could have probably escaped, right? He had a route of supply to get away from Sherman, and Sherman, probably not as thorough in his pursuit, would have probably led him, right? So the war could have actually really continued. So when you have Johnston, who is coming to the table because he knows really he's not going to be able to do that, right? He has this idea that all of his troops are deserting, right? He's not going to be able to take his army anywhere. He's not going to end up with the same numbers when he finally gets to whatever destination he gets to. So he needs to make this negotiation quick from the position of strength that he relatively is in. So on paper, he has this many men. He's losing them pretty much daily, right? He does have this opportunity to get away, so he needs to use that to his advantage. And obviously, this probably would have been the best thing that he could have dreamed of, right? He could have had a situation that was even probably closer to Grant's terms, where the Confederates don't get to keep all their arms, but in this first round of negotiations, they get to keep everything. They get to just go back to their states. And they also get to have this amnesty. The property thing is also pretty concerning, right? It's kind of saying like, yeah, you can hang on to these individuals who have been enslaved until we figure this out in the Constitution. So it's one of those things where Sherman is kind of jumping the gun on really wanting to end the war, and you can kind of see where he's coming from, right? And the writing's on the wall anyway, I think, in my opinion. So it's kind of like, I could see it from his perspective. He's like, all right, what's the big deal? Like, just let them surrender. But then you have guys like Stanton who's like, hey, I kind of want to prosecute some of these guys after the war, or at least have that on the table, right? Especially Jefferson Davis. The sights are going to be kind of trained on him. Some of these other government officials, I really want to be able to bring them to a court of law, maybe. You know, we just had a talk about how we had these conspirators that were just hung for being in this plot to kidnap and then eliminate the president. Well, he's going to want to do some of that on the government side of things, because there still is this question of like, was this kind of a sanctioned hit from the Confederate government? Grant was going to be dispatched to Raleigh to take back over for military affairs. Sherman informed Johnston that the terms had been rejected by Andrew Johnson and his cabinet. Now, this was not going to be good for Johnston. Jefferson Davis was going to wish for him to continue the war, maybe even scatter into the mountains and wage a kind of guerrilla conflict. But discipline in the ragtag force was gone, and men were simply just walking away. To negotiate in a place of not complete weakness meant that Joe would need to act fast. He would meet again with Sherman at Bennett's Place, this time the terms being strictly military in nature. Indeed, they were similar to those that had been rolled out at Appomattox. Schofield suggested there being the primary terms and then the supplemental terms. So the following would be laid out. April 26, 1865. Terms of a military convention entered into this 26th day of April 1865 at Bennett's Place, near Durham Station, North Carolina, between General Joseph E. Johnston, commanding the Confederate Army, and Major General William T. Sherman, commanding the United States Army in North Carolina. 1. All acts of war on the part of the troops under General Johnston's command to cease from this date. 2. all arms and public property to be deposited at Greensboro and delivered to an ordnance officer of the United States Army. 3. Rolls of all the officers and men to be made in duplicate, one copy to be retained by the commander of all the troops, and the other to be given to an officer to be designated by General Sherman, each officer and man to give his individual obligation in writing not to take up arms against the government of the United States until properly released from this obligation. 4. Sidearms of officers and their private horses and baggage to be retained by them. 5. This being done, all the officers and men to be permitted to return to their homes, not to be disturbed by the United States authorities, so long as they observe their obligation and the laws in force where they may reside. Joseph E. Johnston, General Commanding Confederate Forces in North Carolina, William T. Sherman, Raleigh, North Carolina, April 26, 1865, and approved by U.S. Grant, Lieutenant General. Now we have the supplemental terms. First, the Confederate troops to retain their transportation. Second, each brigade or separate body to retain a number of arms equal to 1/7 of its effective total, which, when the troops reach their homes, will be received by the local authorities for public purposes. Third, officers and men to be released from their obligation at the same time with those of the Army of Virginia. Fourth, artillery horses to be used for field transportation when necessary. Fifth, the horses and other private property of officers and men to be retained by them. Sixth, troops from Arkansas and Texas to be transported by water from Mobile or New Orleans to their homes by the United States. Seventh, the obligations of private soldiers to be signed by their company officers. Eighth, naval officers within the limits of General Johnston's command to have the benefit of the stipulations of this convention. So, here we go. We have the terms laid out again, and you can see how very, very different they are, right? And that's kind of the point. These are very much closer to Appomattox. You're not keeping all your arms. You're only keeping a limited number of them, right? Because you would think it would be kind of ridiculous to let this army just go home with everything, right? So you could probably resupply that way. Maybe you, on the way there, you get an idea like, hey, we're all just kind of going home. Maybe we can come up with a larger army. And that's kind of the point, right? Is that not only does Johnston have this army, albeit dwindling in numbers, but he's actually commanding a pretty large part of the Confederate forces that are still in the field. And at least enough that would make it bothersome for the Union forces. At this point, they're probably, without Robert E. Lee's army, they're probably not going to want to continue fighting. If you're from the South, if you're from the North, you're probably thinking much like Sherman, where you're like, hey, why should we even bother in this situation? But obviously, there are 90,000 Confederates that are going to be laying down their arms as a result of this. That's a pretty large number. Now, they're everywhere. They're coastal troops. There's probably some militia in there, too, so probably not the best of an army. But 90,000 is nothing to shake a stick at. So you're going to have, again, this potential that the war could continue at this point. And one of the reasons why Sherman's looking to end it very quickly, obviously we talked about why Johnston is looking to end it very quickly. And then they get these terms that are down here. That's why we're talking about naval officers. The same kind of talk about horses, right? There's even some in here about the transportation of these troops from farther away, Arkansas and Texas. They want to go back home, right? So there's even talk of that. So Washington would agree to terms, Johnston and Sherman ending up toasting. Breckinridge would write a negative depiction of Sherman, especially in light of the drinking. Johnston, of course, had a wide range of control, which included Georgia and the Carolinas. 250,000 rations would be delivered to the Confederate forces arranged by Schofield. Sherman, in the meantime, would rejoice with the rest of the army. Stanton was not satisfied and would wish for the remaining Union forces to pursue who was still at large, that being Jefferson Davis. But there were those who believed that this war was truly over. Robert E. Lee would turn to Penn in order to write to Davis. This is a letter from Robert E. Lee to Jefferson Davis, and it's dated April 20th, 1865. So after the negotiations here have begun at Bennett's place, but before we've actually come to a final conclusion. As you can kind of understand, as you can kind of maybe relate to Jefferson Davis, once Johnston's like, and he's never been on good terms with Johnston either, we should probably point that out too, but once Johnston's like, hey, I'm not actually going to continue fighting at all, and none of the troops under my command here immediately in the vicinity of the Carolinas and Georgia are going to continue fighting at all. Then if you're Jefferson Davis, you're probably like, well, I got to get out of Dodge. And that's essentially what he does. So he's going to continue making his journey further south. And originally, obviously, the goal would be to eventually find friendly forces, find a site where he could reestablish the Confederate government. But that goal is actually going to change very quickly once he realizes, well, there's not going to be any forces, there's not going to be any opportunity to reestablish the Confederate government. I'm going to have to try to make my way, hopefully, to get out of the country. But here we go. At least in the meantime, he's going to be holding on to this hope that maybe the war could continue. But Robert E. Lee is actually going to write this letter that is going to be directed to him. Mr. President, the apprehensions I expressed during the winter of the moral condition of the Army of Northern Virginia have been realized. The operations, which occurred while the troops were in the entrenchments in front of Richmond and Petersburg, were not marked by the boldness and decision which formerly characterized them. Except in particular instances, they were feeble, and a want of confidence seemed to possess officers and men. This condition, I think, was produced by the state of feeling in the country, and the communications received by the men from their homes, urging their return and the abandonment of the field. We've talked a lot about how there is kind of this push from the home front, and especially these soldiers who are seeing Sherman now march through their homes. Obviously, that's going to do a lot to destroy your morale, right? You're not going to want to continue to be in the trench at Petersburg when Sherman's marching through Georgia, marching through the Carolinas. The movement of the enemy on the 30th of March to Dinwiddie Courthouse was consequently not as strongly met as similar ones had been. Advantages were gained by him which discouraged the troops, so on the morning of the 2nd April, when our lines between the Appomattox and Hatcher's Run were assaulted, the resistance was not effectual. Several points were penetrated and large captures made. At the commencement of the withdrawal of the army from the lines in the night of the 2nd, it began to disintegrate, and straggling from the ranks increased up to the surrender on the 9th. On that day, as previously reported, there were only 7,892 effective infantry. During the night when the surrender became known, more than 10,000 men came in, as reported to me by the chief commissary of the army. During the succeeding days, stragglers continued to give themselves up, so that on the 12th of April, according to the rolls of the paroled, 26,018 officers and men had surrendered. Men who had left the ranks on the march and crossed the James River returned and gave themselves up, and many since have come to Richmond and surrendered. I've given these details that Your Excellency might know the state of the feeling which existed in the army and judge that of the country. From what I have seen and learned, I believe an army cannot be organized or supported in Virginia. And as far as I know the condition of affairs, the country east of the Mississippi is morally and physically unable to maintain the contest unaided with any hope of ultimate success. A partisan war may be continued, and hostilities protracted, causing individual suffering and the devastation of the country, but I see no prospect by that means of achieving a separate independence. It is for Your Excellency to decide, should you agree with me in opinion, what is proper to be done. To save useless effusion of blood, I would recommend measures be taken for suspension of hostilities and the restoration of peace. I am with great respect, your obedient servant, R.E. Lee. So pretty powerful, right, from Lee. He's giving him kind of a rundown of exactly what happened when pressed. He had kind of talked about this before, and he mentions it in his letter, how the state of the army is not what it was. It's not in a good spot either. And obviously, case in point example, when the campaign begins, that will eventually become the Appomattox campaign, the breakthrough at Petersburg, the Appomattox campaign, you have this kind of disintegration of the army. They're not going to want to fight anymore, essentially. So he's really kind of hammering this point home, that we had this premier army. The Army of Northern Virginia might have been one of the best armies of the war. It might have been the best army of the war at one point. Certainly, I think it's firing on all cylinders. When you get into, you have Chancellorsville that happens, but then when you get into Pennsylvania, Gettysburg, I think at that point, it might have been the best army, right? You can make an argument for, maybe Grant's army, Sherman's forces, whatever. Army of Potomac is still up there. Obviously, they end up winning the war, so you could obviously end up winning the Battle of Gettysburg, so you could counter argument that. But it needs to be in the discussion of your top 2-3 armies is the Army of Northern Virginia, I think, right? So he's saying, hey, we had this premier fighting force it's no more. This was really what we're hanging a lot of our hopes on, throughout the entire war, is the success of this army and this theater, and it didn't work. So he's kind of pointing that out, and obviously this is stuff that Jefferson Davis knows. He knows this, right? He was there. But he needs to put this down in paper and say, hey, again, these were the best that we had, and it's gone. And now you have Johnson, who's about to surrender, and he's saying, hey, I don't think that if you're going to the Trans-Mississippi, I don't think Kirby Smith has done a great job. Sure, maybe that's what Robert E. Lee is saying. He's been on an island out there. He's done a great job. However, he's not going to be able to continue to successfully wage this war. And you could turn it into a guerrilla conflict, as we mentioned. You could turn it into kind of this partisan style warfare. There's going to be a lot more death in that sense, right? You have the very case in point example of what happened in Missouri. It's a pretty heavy guerrilla war there, and there is a lot of civilian casualty, civilian hardship, loss of life there, right? There's going to be reparations on both sides, and that's not going to be good for anyone. So he is going to point that out. Hey, you could do this. I know you're going to have to make a decision, and the decision is yours, but I'm just kind of laying it all out there for you. So Robert E. Lee is a great example, I think, of somebody who is very much understanding of the scenarios that are going on around him. He's very with it, right? And I think he's kind of shown that throughout the war and what the Confederacy is going to be capable of doing, right? He mentioned how, the famous instance where he mentioned is how if they cross the James, it's going to be over, right? And, that comes to pass. He understands where the opportunities were. He understands that they were lost. And he understands now that the war is over. And there are those who are also going to be in that same boat. So I'm not saying it's just Robert E. Lee, but there are others who are going to be like, yeah, the war is over. Jefferson Davis is still clinging to that hope. And this is where I think, again, we talked about here before we read the letter, it's going to be moving toward continuing the conflict, still hanging on hope for an independent Confederacy. And now it's going to change to, well, we got to get out of here. So with that, I think we can bring everything to a close. Johnston has surrendered at Bennett's place. Lee's army has gone as well. We are really fighting killing to the end, but there are a few scattered events that we need to take care of. We need to end the escape attempt by Jefferson Davis, and also fight the last battle of the war. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to our website as well as Patreon information. Support for general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.